Hey guys, in this video we're going to be talking a little bit about the Noam Chomsky essays that you read. When I was reading some of your summaries, there were a few things that we were getting wrong, or some of us were getting wrong, and so I just want to clarify. We'll go through each page and talk about what he is saying on each page and potential questions that he might be posing on each page of this little essay. So take a second, pause me right now, pull out your Noam Chomsky essays. They look like this. Okay, so the first question on this first page, which is page 23, it says, what is language, how do we acquire it, and how do we use it? So this is thinking about those questions that I said were central questions for our unit. This one is especially interested in the acquisition of language, but that means that how our brains are shaped either around language or by language, right? And here Noam Chomsky is talking about how we know the principles of language before we ever speak. And that is not because we've been introduced to a world of language. I have been using this example in class about how, you are born into this world and someone says, oh, it's a boy, it's a girl. And suddenly we are introduced to the concept of opposites immediately, right? So like we understand not only that there are words that define things, maybe we don't understand this, but we're confronted with this idea. There are words that define things, but we are also confronted with the idea that those words are determined by their opposites. So something is because it is not another thing. Now, it's a difficult concept, but basically Chomsky is saying that's not the way it works. He thinks that we have structures in the brain already that are kind of language centers that mean that we would develop a system of language. No matter what it was, we would develop language. He says, knowledge of language results from the interplay of initially given structures of the mind, maturational processes, and interaction with the environment. So the important part there is that there are initially given structures of the mind. We call this in philosophy a priori structures. So usually we think of in older philosophies, they thought that we had a priori structures that gave us a sense of time and a sense of space. And Chomsky is saying we also have a priori structures for language. So that means that going back to our initial questions, especially the ones that Orwell posed about how our language then affects our thoughts, Chomsky is saying that our thoughts are already language. Maybe they're not, when we are newborns, the kind of language that we end up speaking. We develop that kind of language through experience and through maturational processes, like he says. But we are free to think the way that we were meant to think, according to Chomsky, because we already have those structures. And this is a pretty optimistic kind of point of view when you compare it to Orwell. So Orwell believed that we were kind of stuck in this circle of someone says something stupid, it gets into our head, we start thinking of it in a stupid way, and it just sort of snowballs into stupidity. But Chomsky is saying actually that language is a creative process, that we're not just absorbing everything that everyone says and building our thoughts around that, but that there is something unique and individual about our thoughts that we can then place into language. So he says this creativity is apparent in the richness and complexity and enormous range of what you can produce. It comes down to this: you are free to say what you want, you can say what you think, and you can think what you want, which is way more freeing than what Orwell was saying. Orwell hinted that we might get out of this habit of language, but he never really said how. And here Orwell is saying we are always out of the habit of language, we are always free to think and to speak. And one question we might think about this though, and Chomsky answers this a little bit in other essays, but not this one. Where do those categories come from? Are they genetic built in, or how does a priori categories, how do they work? We have language centers in the brain. Is that what it is? Or is this something about human nature? Is it something more broader, spiritual maybe, about language? I'm not so sure. So that's the first page. Okay, your next page is page 25. The question on this page is, what does the mind know when it knows a language, and how does it know it? And here Chomsky's talking about how Grammar is far too complex to actually learn. If you sat down with a child and you tried to explain grammatical principles in order to teach them a language, it would be impossible. There is a meme that's gone around for a while. I will post it on Canvas, but for now I'm just going to read it to you. It says, "Things native English speakers know but don't know we know." Adjectives in English absolutely have to be in this order: opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose, noun. So you can have a lovely little old rectangular green French silver whittling knife, but if you mess with that word order in the slightest, you'll sound like a maniac. It's an odd thing that every English speaker uses that list, but almost none of us could write it out. And as size comes before color, green great dragons can't exist. So to go along with Chomsky, what kind of is shown there is that there's this like natural order of language that we were never explicitly taught. No English teacher ever sat down and said, oh, opinion comes first and then color or anything like that. But it is something that we already had in our heads. Now, my question here is, how do we know that that's not mimicry? Right? Like, how do we know that children are just not very, very adept at kind of like mimicking the patterns of speech? But Chomsky would say it's far too complicated for mimicry to explain everything. So that means that there's a part of our brain built in that says that kind of word order, which is pretty amazing. And the other thing that he talks about on this page is that interpretation, the ability to understand language, happens before experience. And that's part of the fundamentals of language that is so important, is that we can describe abstract concepts through words, and you don't have to experience that concept in order to understand what it means. And for Chomsky, that is another piece of evidence that we always had the ability to understand the world in language. And so he uses this idea of climbing. You could explain the concept of climbing to a child, and they would kind of understand what that meant without ever seeing someone climb or climbing themselves. They could understand that experience. Okay, page 27 is also talking about human capabilities of creativity through language. And here he's talking about this idea that a state authority or some sort of controlling figure might be able to shape behavior. He's really interested in what's called behaviorism, which if you've taken a psychology class, you know about. But it's basically the study of psychology about how like rewards and punishments shape behavior. So with a child, it's like the child says nonsense words, right? And it's like meh, 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 meh. That's a baby, by the way. And then the mom's sort of like, no, that's not it. No, no. And she's not going to be like super like mean about it, like, no, baby, say it right or pay the price, right? But she is saying like, she subtly is giving sort of rewards or punishments for certain sounds. And when the baby says ma, then she would give a kind of reward, like, oh my gosh, she said ma. And this is going to cause the baby to keep saying ma and mom and mommy, and it's going to kind of like escalate from there, right? And so for Orwell, that's a kind of controlling idea. But Chomsky is saying that's not the way that language works. It says that human beings, if language is seen as an intrinsic human characteristic, then it's the language that itself that provides the framework for intellectual development, the growth of moral consciousness, cultural achievement, and participation in a free community. So language doesn't shape and control us. Language allows the ability to be creative. So we might all agree on a certain word for something, right? But through the process of language, you can express original ideas. And that is something that Orwell is suspicious of, but Chomsky calls a highly creative act. Just the act of speaking, like what I am doing right now, is a highly creative act, according to Chomsky. So that can make us feel very good. Yes. Okay, the last little bit of evidence that Chomsky talks about in this packet for his ideas here that language is intrinsic and not something that we only learn is this sentence that he talks about. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which has been the source of poems and arguments and music and so on. Okay, it's a nonsense sentence. You don't need to worry about what that means. But basically, he is saying that if you spoke that sentence, someone understands it as English and understands it as a proper form of English. And that is because of the language centers in our brain. So he would say that, okay, so you go to the most sort of remote community you could find in the Amazon that has never heard of something called English. I don't know if that exists anymore, but let's say that it does. And you go there and you start speaking your language. Even if you do not understand their language, you've never heard it before, and they have never heard your language, when you speak to each other, you will be able to tell what is a language and what isn't, right? So it might sound like clicks or grunts or nonsense things, but we know that it's not expressing like an emotional reaction. We know that it is actually language trying to communicate an abstract idea. And for him, he's saying like just that recognition of what a language is a sign that our brains were already structured for it. So basically, to take it all back to our central questions, especially this question about does language control our thoughts or do our thoughts control our language? For Chomsky, he's saying these are inextricable. Like you can't say that there is this sort of, we've been talking about how there's like this veneer of language potentially, and that you can't get under it to access all this knowledge, but this is almost like pure knowledge, and everything above has been tainted by us knowing words that have restricted us into certain categories of thinking, right? But for Chomsky, he's saying this line doesn't exist because all of it, it's all thought and language. Like it's all mixed up together. We as human beings are language. So that kind of goes with Ansel Dua too, when she says, I am my language. But when Ansel Dua is talking about culturally her language sort of shaping her, Chomsky, I think, would be a little bit more interested in how she then is shaping her language as a kind of creative act. So that is Noam Chomsky. I hope that's a little bit clearer now.